You know, the other day I was watching a video by a popular Zelda-centric content creator, and they said that Tears of the Kingdom was the most divisive and controversial game in the series, and I was just sitting there thinking to myself, did you play Skyward Sword at launch? The lead up to Skyward Sword saw the Zelda series at a very precarious point. The fanbase has had a division in art style preference between the more realistic Twilight Princess versus the cartoony Wind Waker. The past few games have delved more and more into linearity and had an ever-increasing presence of motion controls. And outside of Twilight Princess releasing on the Wii at the same time as it did on the GameCube, there wasn't really a full-fledged Zelda game for Nintendo's mainline console yet. Skyward Sword sought to remedy these issues by combining the realistic character proportions of Twilight Princess with an art style more inspired by Wind Waker, launching as one of Nintendo's most anticipated releases late into the Wii's life cycle, and to double, triple, quadruple down on the focus of motion controls. Now, the first two were honestly a cause for celebration, but the last point really started to worry a large section of the Zelda fanbase. Nintendo was riding a massive wave of success thanks to the Wii's stranglehold on casual audiences because of the Wiimote's motion capabilities. And while everyone found a ton of joy in playing Wii Sports, there was a lot of crossover into many of Nintendo's mainline franchises that people were a little less than happy to see. Metroid Prime 3, Super Mario Galaxy, and Mario Kart Wii all use motion controls to some varying degree, and while some worked well or were a little bit less intrusive than others, nothing before had looked as in-depth or as over the top as what we started to see with Skyward Sword. This is where the Wii Motion Plus comes into play, an expansion for the standard Wiimote that added gyroscopic movement for more precise motion controls. Skyward Sword was actually one of the few games published by Nintendo that required this add-on. And you know, while I did say more precise a second ago, I will also say that this is in massive air quotes because take a look no further than the live demonstration of Skyward Sword back at E3 2010 to see what went wrong here. God bless Shigeru Miyamoto's heart, but I remember watching this live on G4, and back when all of the E3s had a healthy amount of cringe, this ranks up there with some of the hardest to watch moments. A new 3D Zelda game was like an event or a milestone in gaming history that can oftentimes serve as a turning point for the industry. But the presentation for Skyward Sword kind of landed with a thud, just like the multiple thuds that hit Miyamoto's shield as he struggled to showcase the game's motion controls. The disappointing presentation was eventually chalked up to having too much interference during the press conference to properly showcase the game, but the impression that it made on people had already set in. A lot of Zelda fans weren't sure what to make of this game. When Skyward Sword did release, it was met with near universal acclaim from nearly every major outlet, which rejuvenated players' hopes in what they were about to experience. And when people finally got their hands on it, it proved to be unlike any other Zelda game that came before it, but not necessarily for all the right reasons. There were a ton of people who did not like the motion controls, and you know, that was something that everybody kind of knew going in beforehand. However, what many players weren't expecting was for this to be by far the most linear 3D game in the series, or how much needless padding was added, or for how bland that some characters such as Fi were. At the time, it was almost impossible to have a positive conversation about Skyward Sword because the issues that this game had were just so prominent, so frequent, and so inescapable in many players' eyes that it was just seen as one of the worst games in the entire Zelda series that should never be repeated again. But after the release of Breath of the Wild, with it being a massive restructure on the 3D Zelda formula, I started to see a little bit more of a change in the way people thought about Skyward Sword, and admittedly, I'm in that camp too. After playing a far more experimental 3D Zelda game, I started to appreciate some of the things that Skyward Sword actually had going for it. Thematically and structurally speaking, the dungeon design was debatably one of the best in the entire series. And even if this game was on the linear side, it had a strong narrative with some of the best character chemistry that the franchise had ever seen up to that point. And all this was heavily punctuated when we received an HD remaster of Skyward Sword for the Nintendo Switch that among all of its improvements, the most important was adding a more traditional control scheme that makes the game a far more enjoyable experience to actually sit down and play. Skyward Sword is still a game that has a ton of problems that an HD remaster cannot fix, but a lot of the big things were given some really strong alternative options that I do think makes this game far more appealing than it was before. This game has grown to be something that I consider to be an overall great entry to the franchise, even if it is also still probably a title that I think has some of the largest issues. To me, it's still the black sheep of the 3D Zelda games, even if I do think it's very enjoyable in its own ways. Skyward Sword takes place all the way at the beginning of the Zelda timeline, as it actually serves as a series of events for which its franchise gets its namesake. This means that not only do we have a new Link in Zelda, but the first Link in Zelda, in a time before the Kingdom of Hyrule was ever founded. Our setting this time around takes place in Skyloft, a series of floating islands in a small village. The people of Skyloft have some traditions that are far removed from what the people of Hyrule would someday adopt, such as the lack of having a traditional fantasy kingdom, in favor of the prime authority figures being the Knights Academy, who keep the peace as they fly around on these large birds called Loftwings. Zelda, instead of being a princess, is a daughter of the head of the academy, and Link, instead of being a random kid from the woods or an island, is working to become a knight. And these two have actually spent the majority of their lives growing up together as friends. This is until a tornado whisks Zelda away down into the dangerous land below and sees Link teaming up with the servant of the goddess Fi so he can save his childhood friend. So yeah, it's another story about saving Zelda. Real shocker there, right? In fact, there are a number of themes that really should be familiar to anyone who's played a 3D Zelda game before, such as having a companion character, getting the Master Sword, interacting with ancient guardian beings that will assist Link, meeting several fantasy races, having music be a key component for progression, coming toe-to-toe with an antagonist who is a servant of their master, and even traveling through time makes another return here. It's almost like Skyward Sword took a bullet point list from the events of every previous Zelda game and made sure to hit all of the same notes. So with that being said, you might think this could be kind of a by-the-numbers Zelda story, but you'd be dead wrong with that assumption because of one primary reason: the characters. I don't think there is a Zelda game that has been able to elicit the same emotion out of me that this one did. Skyward Sword has characters that really grow with each other over time and have fantastic interactions with one another, and you end up actually caring for what happens to them. Let me give you probably my favorite example with Zelda. She is just adorable this time around. In most games prior to this, Zelda and Link barely interact with each other. Zelda is either only seen at the end of the game, or she makes such a sporadic appearance that you kind of forget she's even there sometimes. And when she is there, she has next to no personality. Now, of course, you have some games such as Wind Waker and Spirit Tracks that do a lot to really make Zelda more prevalent. And I mean, guess what some of the most well-liked aspects of those games are too? And it's funny that I mentioned those two games in particular because Skyward Sword Zelda is in pretty stiff competition with those two for who has the best portrayal of the character in the entire series, with maybe Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom Zelda being in that conversation. Her relationship with Groose, who has a massive crush on her, but Zelda always scolds him for acting like a jerk. She's a side of Zelda that is more hot-headed and authoritative than any other version of this character. The student-mentor relationship that she has with Impa that eventually leads to one of the most emotional twists in the game is also fantastic. The fact that Zelda and Link together in this game actually have some real romantic chemistry, and it is so fucking cute. But there's more to it than that. Zelda is actually out doing something this time around. She's not waiting in a castle or turned into stone or asleep or whatever. She is playing an active role in the events of the story, and even if we don't get to interact with her too much after we initially part ways, we are constantly reminded of her presence throughout the adventure. There are, of course, other great character interactions too, such as Impa constantly berating Link for not living up to the Hero of Legend moniker, which, by the way, is one of, if not the best portrayal of Impa in this game too. We have Groose, who initially starts off as a comedy relief bully, but through his interactions with Link and the old woman throughout the adventure, he begins to make himself useful and find his own place in the world, which I think is fantastic. We gotta see more cameo appearances from Groose from now on. He's just one of the best side characters that the series has ever done. And of course, we have our two antagonists with Girahim and Demise. Now, Demise is just sort of a name that you hear throughout the game until the end, so he's more of a presence felt sort of deal, and when you do meet him, he's sort of just okay. He's technically one of the most important figures in the entire franchise, since he's actually the catalyst for all of the trouble that Hyrule goes through throughout the rest of time. I also kind of like the fact that he actually has a little bit of respect for Link standing up to him, but we really only see Demise in the last 30 minutes of the game, so it really doesn't amount to too much. Now, the villain that we see most of is Girahim, and I have to say, he is a very different villain from what we usually see in the series. Flamboyant, cocky, and also incredibly vicious, he leaves a pretty strong lasting impression, especially with this weird, creepy tongue fling thing he does. Ugh. I'd put him up there with Zant personally, and again, I'd like to see more of him. So yeah, almost all the characters I think really hit it out of the park and make this story one of the overall best in the franchise. Almost all of them. This is Fi, or Fi, or whatever. She is probably the worst companion character in the entire series, so I don't think it really matters. So I don't have the same vitriolic hatred that a lot of people have for Fi, but I'd also be lying if I said that I enjoyed her character in any reasonable capacity. Her shtick is that she's just super analytical and has no personality. Her most defining character trait is that she will calculate the probability of outcomes, and if you don't like that running gag, too bad, that's all you're getting with her. She'll pop up as often as Midna did, but will never really contribute anything other than just analyzing the situation. There's like one semblance of some character happening with Fi, and that's when the scrapper robot has a crush on her, but Fi just kind of stares at him for a moment and she basically just no-sells him. That's it though, that's the most character we're getting out of her. She's pretty boring, and even after everything that we go through throughout the story, Skyward Sword still has the gall to say that she's grown human emotions in the last cutscene she's in the game, which, no, I'm not buying that. There are plenty of characters that have gone through this arc in other games. Take a look at someone like Aegis from Persona 3, for example. Fi is no Aegis. This was just really not done well in my opinion. Also, just a personal thing, I really hate Fi's animations in general. Her dances just seem so forced, and her facial expressions while singing just look straight up uncanny. Which, these are kind of the only few knocks I can take on Skyward Sword's visuals, well, outside of whatever they did to Link's lips here. The rest of the game, I think, looks pretty damn great. Skyward Sword takes a vibrant color palette from the Wind Waker and has slightly more realistic character designs like Twilight Princess, and comes to what I think is a pretty happy middle ground. We even see some characters get cameos in their models like Beetle, the Happy Mask Salesman, and of course, the weird hand in the toilet from Majora's Mask. I especially love all the environmental design in this game. It's almost like looking at a watercolor painting. Still a little heavy on the bloom effect and is rather blurry in some areas, which playing the HD version on the Switch, you kind of expect it to look a little bit better than it does. Speaking of things that you'd expect to be a little bit better, here comes the soundtrack. And that honestly kind of pains me to say, considering that Nintendo went out of their way to get a full orchestra this time around. It does most certainly add to the more grandiose feel, but it is a bit less dynamic than what we saw in Twilight Princess, which is something that I thought really elevated the game's atmosphere, especially when it comes to its boss battles. And that's not saying that Skyward Sword's soundtrack is bad or anything, since there's a lot of really solid pieces too, my favorite being the Ballad of the Goddess and the main theme for how triumphant they are, and Groos's theme for being the exact opposite reasons. This game was the first 3D Zelda game to start having character-specific themes, which I'm always a big fan of, especially when they have some slight different instrumentation in different contexts. The rest of the soundtrack is fine. Fitting in the areas that you see them, sure, but not too much really stands out here, unfortunately leaving Skyward Sword's presentation feeling overall good, but a bit of a step down from what we saw in basically every other 3D Zelda game before it. Skyward Sword brings a lot of new stuff to the table. In fact, I'd go as far to say that it did the most to reinvent the Zelda series until Breath of the Wild came out in 2017. It's just a shame that the reinvention really did not stick the landing. Let's get into the defining trait of Skyward Sword with the emphasis on motion controls. Now, from what I can see, people fall into one of two camps. They either don't mind the motion controls and think that they're mostly tolerable, and then there are the people who fucking hate them and think they make the game unplayable. So you know how in Twilight Princess on the Wii you had to waggle the remote to have Link swing his sword? Well, it's the same story here, but now you have the Wii Motion plus his gyroscope, giving a little bit more accuracy to Link's sword swings as he slashes in different directions. Keyword here being a little bit more, because I still find this control scheme to be horribly disjointed with how much input delay motion controls typically have. In fact, I would go as far to say that this is the most intrusive example of motion controls inside of a first-party Nintendo game. You will use the motion controls for everything, from swinging your sword, aiming your bow, using your shield bash, flying your loft wing, everything. You are either going to be on board with this, or this is going to be a deal breaker for you, full stop. I personally found the motion controls too unwieldy when I played initially on the Wii, but when the HD version for the Nintendo Switch came out, I did notice a small improvement since the Joy-Cons tech-wise are a few generations ahead of the Wiimote. That being said, I still don't think this is the control scheme for me, which thankfully the HD version has a much more traditional option. Now you can use the right stick to position Link's sword and quickly flip the stick in that direction and Link will slash the same way. It kind of almost reminds me of Kingdom Come Deliverance's combat, which is a comparison I never thought I would make. Is this control scheme perfect? Not even close. Is it an improvement that I think makes the game massively more enjoyable? Definitely. So how does this new control style actually show up in gameplay? Well, for starters, combat now has this more rock, paper, scissors sort of gimmick. Enemies will always be blocking from a couple different directions, and you need to slash your sword from the area that has an opening. It's okay. I kind of got some split thoughts on this though. On one hand, it definitely takes a lot more thought than any other Zelda game in the series, with fights like the ones with Girahim being a pretty decent challenge to test the players on what they've already learned. Encounters are now much more personal and deliberate, which up until this point, the series has never really done before. On the other hand, this game suffers tremendously from the issue of having one enemy rushing at you at a time, and it can be pretty immersion breaking, seeing goons just hanging out in the back while waiting their turn. I would say that there's more positive than negatives here, but it's still far from a perfect combat system. The motion controls also make their way into the puzzles, and these are just alright too, I suppose. Pretty basic stuff like making sure you slash doors in a series of motions correctly, or having an eyeball follow the tip of your sword, or drawing out a certain shape to complete a pattern. Honestly, I feel like they're a little bit less interesting than what we already saw in the likes of Phantom Hourglass or Spirit Tracks, which, you know, different hardware, sure, but I just felt like those games made a bit more clever usage with what they had to work with, you know? All in all, even if you do take the motion controls out of Skyward Sword, you're still left with a game that was built around this core premise, and without that there, it feels like this game is missing something. Like it or not, every aspect of Skyward Sword was designed with the Wii motion capabilities in mind, and a more traditional control scheme really exposes the underlying issues that this game has with its encounter and puzzle design, so in a way, you can't really escape it. This leaves even the simple act of controlling Skyward Sword either a gimmicky, frustrating game, or one that feels a bit disjointed and hollow depending on which route you take. One other thing that Skyward Sword does not get enough notice for is the implementation of the stamina meter to the series, and it's pretty primitive, and I don't think necessarily adds too much to the game. You pretty much just use it to sprint or do this weird wall run kick thingy, and that's about all she wrote. That being said, it's probably for the best that we don't have our stamina be drained with every sword swing, so take that for what you will. Same sort of weird mechanic comes with the shield durability. Like, just seems like an unnecessary addition that adds absolutely nothing to the game. It's as simple as bringing a repair potion or getting it repaired in Skyloft between surface visits. It's just an extra step for something that you never had to do before. In fact, the whole weird inventory system that has you balance shields, bottles, and charms for passive buffs is also, I don't know, another strange addition that really doesn't change that much. In a way, it kind of feels like they were just throwing stuff at a wall to see what sticks. Skyward Sword's other big claim to fame is its titular sky area, which almost acts like the Hyrule Field of this game, but instead of riding on Epona, we use these giant birds called Loftwings. That being said, outside of just being able to change your altitude, there really isn't that much of a difference for how you would handle these guys. You still have a charge option, but there really aren't that many enemies in the sky to collide with, so it's not like you'll be using this for anything other than to get an occasional speed boost. And you know, for it being one of the main gimmicks of this game, you pretty much only use your Loftwing for getting from one area to the next, which is honestly a little disappointing. Yet you do have the one boss battle a little bit later in the game that's actually a pretty good time, even if it is a bit on the easy side. But other than that, it's pretty slim pickings for this gimmick. I like it for what it is, but man, there just feels like a massive disconnect between gameplay in the skies above versus the land below. The divide between the sky and the land really brings me to talking about the level design, and man, what a mixed bag we've got here. First up, we have Skyloft, our central hub for this game. Now, Zelda games don't really do the whole hub thing too often, but when they do, they're often phenomenally well done, with Clocktown from Majora's Mask being the biggest highlight. And while Skyloft doesn't necessarily hit those same heights, no pun intended, like and subscribe, I do think it probably represents the second best hub in the entire series, and it's for a lot of the same reasons that I think makes Clocktown so special. Let's see, plenty of mini games to do, check. Interesting visuals, check. Different shops to buy various things, check. Tons of NPCs to do side quests for, check, check, check. This is actually one of the most surprising things about Skyward Sword in my opinion, the quality of the side content. It makes every return visit back to Skyloft so interesting since stuff gradually develops over the course of the game, and a lot of the side content feeds back into having some very strong rewards. Upgrades to items, heart pieces, extra rupees, upgrades to our gear, some side quests that have their own stories. There's some really good stuff here. So Skyloft is a fantastic area in this game, but oh boy, the surrounding islands are not. Now, there are a couple of points of interest like the Pumpkin Tavern or a few minigame areas, but most of these islands have absolutely nothing to do on them. In fact, many of them are just copy and pasted from each other, with the only real reason to go to them is if they have a goddess chest present. Yeah, those are essentially these little cubes on the surface that Link can hit with the goddess strike to open a chest on one of these islands. Admittedly, a pretty lame collectible. And speaking of both the surface and being kind of lame, let's get into that. I really do not like these areas. They feel, and I know this kind of sounds like a dumb way to put this, kind of like they come from the wrong video game. Take for example this trip down to Lake Fiora. You could convince me that this level design was reused from something like Mario Galaxy, and I would actually believe you. There's no towns, NPCs are just standing around the map in static positions, there aren't really any side quests, and there really isn't any reason to go back through these areas outside of maybe farming for a few resources for item upgrades. Not to mention, everything is segmented off, which makes this more primitive version of Hyrule feel less like a cohesive world and more like a list of video game level tropes. And that's not to say that these levels are poorly designed by any means, because I see the vision here. Farron has one of the more wide open environments, Eldin focuses on verticality, and Lanayru has these time stones that allow Link to alter the world around him to how it was in the distant past, which is a fantastic gimmick. It's definitely the best out of the three regions. It's just that these levels feel out of place compared to other Zelda locations, and I can't say that this was a good change. These areas now feel like they're more linear paths to the dungeons as capstones, which is fine per se, just not exactly what I'm looking for. Now the dungeons on the other hand, and maybe I'll catch a little bit of flack from saying this, I think this might actually be the best lineup in the entire series. The one negative thing I will say is that we do have a little bit of overlap in tropes since every area does have 2 dungeons, and our final dungeon does the Zelda thing where they take bits and pieces of previous dungeon assets and kind of stitch them together, so that definitely can be a bit tiresome, but I still really like a lot of the dungeons in this game. You've got the Lanayru mining facility for having a unique technological focused dungeon that utilizes the time stone mechanic. You have the fire sanctuary that actually does some fun stuff with changing the flow of the lava. The sand ship is a whole robot pirate themed area that has you jump back and forth between the past and the present. That one is fucking awesome. The best of these is easily the Ancient Cistern though. What initially starts out to being a pretty basic water dungeon eventually turns into a temple based on a Japanese short story with some heavily Buddhist themed architecture. They really hit it out of the park with this dungeon design, and I kind of wish this is where the series went afterwards because this is a legitimately awesome and unique idea. Of course, the dungeons aren't complete without our items, which you get some new ones, like the beetle and digging mitts, which are definitely fun, but they're far from the most creative Zelda items. We also see a lot of old items get new applications, such as having the ability to roll bombs. I think the really interesting thing here is that you can actually upgrade a lot of these items through one of the many shops in Skyloft. Far from necessary, but it's a fun little addition that I think can come up pretty useful in a few situations. Other highlights of the dungeons are the bosses, even though the roster is admittedly pretty slim pickings. Koloktos is clearly the fan favorite here, and I'm in agreement with that, but a lot of the other bosses might get repeated a bit too much. 2 fights with Moldarok, 3 with Girahim, and 3 with the Imprisoned. Oh yeah, let's talk about that boss fight because it fucking sucks. You spend the whole time smacking his toes, and he's a pain in the ass to move around, and if you let him get to the top, the whole fight starts over. It's such a boring and unfun boss fight, and when this game asks you to do it 3 times, with literally 2 of those encounters coming in the span of an hour, my patience really starts to wear thin. And that brings me to one of Skyward Sword's biggest flaws. The padding. Now every Zelda game has sections in between dungeons for a little bit of a change of pace, but Skyward Sword goes way overboard. You'll fight bosses you've already beat multiple times. You'll be asked to go through the first dungeon of the game all over again just to get an item at the end. But I think the most egregious example of this is how often you'll come back to the same 3 areas over and over again. So you have your initial run through of the Farron, Eldin, and Lanayru regions, and these are fine. They all have their problems, but they're okay for the most part. But during the halfway point of the game, things get a little bit more annoying. Now you'll have to go back to these areas again, but things are slightly different. First up, you'll have these sections that essentially act as a mix of the bug-killing Twilight sections in Twilight Princess, and the Temple of the Ocean King instant-killing enemies, and Stealth of Phantom Hourglass. If you don't like the sound of that, you're going to hate these parts of the game. Side note, getting chased by these guys might actually be the most anxiety-inducing thing in any Zelda game to date. these guys can scare the shit out of you. Thankfully, these second trips through these regions do at least have you exploring some sub areas that are a little different, with the Sea of Sand and Lanayru being my favorite example. Plus, these new parts of the map do end up leading towards another dungeon, so I can get behind them a little bit. The third time you need to come back through these levels for the Song of the Hero is 100% padding, and I can't stand it. The swimming for musical notes in Farron, the weird stealth and item retrieval segment in Eldin, the wild goose chase in Lanayru, all contrived padding that really didn't need to be a part of the game. And even with all the updates that the HD version provides, these parts are still inescapable. I think this needless method of adding game time really brings Skyward Sword down overall. This is a game that just doesn't know when to end, and while there are a lot of things to love about Skyward Sword, there is only so much I can gloss over when I'm fighting the same bosses over and over again or trekking through the same areas for a third unnecessary time. You know, somewhere out there is an alternate timeline where Skyward Sword was a universal success and became the new template for the 3D Zelda formula instead of Breath of the Wild. We do not live in that timeline. This is the Dark Souls 2 of the Zelda series, or the Final Fantasy VIII. Skyward Sword is a good game, a great game even, but man does it have a lot of problems. There was clearly a lot of ambition put into this, from the dungeon design, storytelling, unique art style, and even some of the things that I don't think fully worked out, like the motion controls or full-on orchestra, I still have to admire the effort for. And while I do enjoy or at least tolerate a lot of these things, the overly linear design, repeated encounters, strange design decisions, and Fi's entire existence really bring this game down. I still like it a lot, but every other 3D Zelda game is something I consider a must-play title, and Skyward Sword is unfortunately not. It's because of this that I still can definitely recommend Skyward Sword as a good game to you, but maybe consider playing the other 3D ones and a few of the better 2D entries first. You could do a whole lot worse, but I do believe you could do a bit better.